Right now, as you are watching this, the Government of Canada's own official wildfire update puts the number of active fires burning across the country at 796, including 60 that firefighting crews have given a full response to, and still cannot bring under control. Independent trackers pulling directly from provincial and territorial fire feeds put the number even higher this morning, closer to 870, with more than 3 million hectare. Already burned this season. Smoke from those fires has already blanketed the Manhattan skyline, forced Chicago to close it, zone beaches, and left more than 100 million people across the United States under some form of air quality alert within the same 2-week stretch. European scientists monitoring the smoke from space say plumes have reached as far as the Arctic in one direction and out over the Atlantic Ocean in the other. What makes this season genuinely alarming to the fire scientists tracking it is not just the raw number of fires burning today, it is how fast that number got here. 10 days before hitting this scale, Canada's wildfire season was running below its own 5-year average. This is the story of how a slow, quiet start to the year exploded into a national emergency in about a week and a half, and what is actually driving fires at this scale across a country most people do not associate with fire danger. This severe. No hype, no exaggeration, just what the data from Canada's own fire agency says. Drop a comment and tell me if you have felt the smoke from these fires where you live, even if you are nowhere near Canada itself, because the reach of this smoke has genuinely surprised a lot of people this summer. If you want grounded wildfire coverage instead of a scary headline with no explanation behind it, subscribe. It is free, and it's like helps this reach the people who need to see this today. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one. Thank you. Now let us get into it. To understand how this season went from quiet to national emergency in roughly 10 days, you have to go back to the exact same weather system responsible for a different disaster entirely. The heat dome that trapped much of the central and eastern United States under record temperatures in the first week of July did not stop at the border. That same ridge of high pressure sat directly over Ontario during the same stretch, producing hot, dry conditions that primed the land surface for exactly the kind of dangerous, fiery weather meteorologists dread, according to analysis from NASA's own Goddard Space Flight Center tracking the smoke by satellite. Vegetation that had been holding moisture through a comparatively quiet spring dried out rapidly under that heat, and once ignition. Sources, whether lightning strikes or human activity, meant that newly dried fuel fires spread far faster than fire crews were staffed or positioned to handle. The numbers from Canada's own National Wildland Fire Summary make the speed of that escalation difficult to overstate. On the 7th of July, the total area burned nationally for the entire season sat at less than half the 10-year average, a genuinely slow pace by historical standards. Just 10 days and more than 300 new wildfires later, that total had reached 2.78 million hectares, already 300,000 hectares above the 10-year average for that date, and the total fire count of 3,656 had surpassed the 25-year historical average of 3,652 fires for the season. A season that opened well below normal, crossed into above normal territory in under 2 weeks. The crisis is national in scope, but it is concentrated hardest in specific regions, and understanding where helps explain why the response has struggled to keep pace. Ontario has taken the heaviest hit of any province, with close to 200 wildfires burning across the province at the peak of this stretch, more than 130 of them concentrated in the northwest region alone, and over 60 burning fully out of control. Fire districts around Nipigon, Sioux Lookout, Red Lake, Dryden, and Fort Francis have borne the worst of it, with provincial fire managers describing conditions there as producing what they specifically called extreme fire behavior, forceful enough that crews have in some cases been forced to abandon direct attack on the flames entirely and fall back to protecting structures and communities instead. Farther east, Nova Scotia has dealt with its own serious outbreaks, including the Mooseland Road wildfire burning roughly 100 kilometers northeast of Halifax, part of a provincial season that has already cost the LIFA of one firefighter battling a blaze in Annapolis County earlier this year. In the north, the Northwest Territories has had wildfires burning persistently since late June, with the European Union's Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service describing the intensity there as comparable to the extreme fire years of 2023A. And 2014, two of the worst wildfire seasons Canada has ever recorded. Indigenous communities have been among the hardest hit by the disruption, with Neskantaga First Nation in northern Ontario declaring its own state of emergency over the direct threat fires posed to the community itself, not just the smoke drifting away from it. Not every part of the country is experiencing this crisis the same way, and the contrast matters for understanding where the danger is actually concentrated right now. Western Canada, including much of British Columbia, has benefited from recent widespread and sustained precipitation, leaving most of that region sitting at low to moderate fire danger, even as the east burns, with only localized pockets of higher risk in the interior of the province. Government forecasters expect that pattern to hold into August in general terms, while specifically flagging the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, northern Manitoba, and the areas surrounding Hudson Bay as the regions where fire danger is expected to remain highest through the rest of the summer, alongside elevated risk continuing across northern Ontario and Quebec. That regional split, a genuinely quiet west sitting beside a genuinely overwhelmed east and north, is part of why national fire statistics can sound almost reassuring in one sentence. Current 2026 seasonal activity nationally remains below the 5-year average, according to the government's own July update, while sounding like a full-blown emergency in the next, because the areas actually burning are burning at rates that outpace anything in recent memory, even while the national average stays technically moderate. The consequences of this fire activity have reached far beyond Canada's own borders, and the smoke itself has become the story for tens of millions of people who have never been anywhere near an actual wildfire. By the middle of July, more than 100 million people across the United States were under active air quality alerts because of smoke drifting south from these fires, with the thickest plumes settling over the Great Lakes region, the Midwest, and stretching all the way to the East Coast. The Manhattan skyline was obscured by haze thick enough to draw national attention, and officials in Chicago closed the city's own beaches as smoke pushed air quality into unhealthy territory. The Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service, which tracks these plumes from satellite data, reported that some of the smoke reached as far north as the Arctic and as far out as the North Atlantic. Ocean, while separately monitoring whether smoke might drift over New Jersey during the World Cup final between Spain and Argentina on the 19th of July, a genuinely unusual example of wildfire smoke becoming a factor, sports organizers had to actively track. Health officials on both sides of the border have repeatedly warned that the fine particles carried in wildfire smoke are more dangerous to breathe than pollution from most other sources, since those particles are small enough to travel deep into the lungs and bloodstream, triggering everything from asthma attacks to an elevated risk of heart attack and stroke in vulnerable populations. The strain this pace of escalation has placed on Canada's own firefighting resources is worth naming directly because it explains why so many of these fires remain listed as out of control, even with crews actively assigned to them. 60 of the fires the federal government's own update classify S as receiving full response, meaning trained crews, aircraft, and equipment already actively working the fire are still burning out of control, not because those crews are failing, but because the sheer number of simultaneous fires across multiple provinces has spread Canada's available firefighting capacity thinner than in a typical season. In past years, with escalations of this speed, provinces have requested international assistance and moved to the country's highest national preparedness level, pulling in personnel and equipment from every jurisdiction in Canada, along with support from allied countries, a step that reflects genuine strain on domestic resources rather than routine seasonal firefighting. There is a comparison worth placing this season inside, because the numbers alone can be hard to judge without historical context. Canada's genuinely worst wildfire season on record remains 2023, when more than 15 million hectares burned nationally. Smoke from that season produced the historic orange, low-visibility haze that engulfed much of the east coast of the United States for days at a time. 2025, by comparison, burned roughly 4.6 million hectares through a comparable point in the season. This year's total, sitting above the 10-year average but still well below 2023's record pace, places 2026 in a genuinely difficult middle position, worse than a typical year by a meaningful margin, concentrated with unusual intensity in specific regions, but not yet approaching the historic extremes of the worst season Canada has ever recorded. Fire scientists studying the trajectory have specifically flagged the speed of this year's escalation rather than its total size so far as the detail that concerns them most, since a season capable of adding 300 new fires and crossing multiple historical averages within 10 days, is a season that can still change dramatically before it is over, particularly with above-average temperatures and dry conditions forecast to continue across much of the country through August. So, what does all of this actually mean for you, wherever you happen to be watching this from? If you live in Canada, particularly anywhere in Ontario, the Northwest Territories, or northern Manitoba and Quebec, the practical takeaway is straightforward. Fire danger in your specific region is forecast to remain elevated through the rest of the summer regardless of what the national average suggests, and staying current with provincial evacuation alerts rather than relying on national level news coverage is the single most useful habit sitting inside everything we just walked through. If you live anywhere in the United States, particularly the Great Lakes region, the Midwest, or the Northeast, the lesson from this exact season is that wildfire. Smoke from a fire, burning hundreds or even thousands of miles away, can still push your own local air quality into genuinely unhealthy territory, with little warning, which makes checking your local air quality index during smoke events and limiting outdoor exertion when it climbs into unhealthy ranges a habit worth building regardless of how far you personally live from an actual flame. The honest, grounded summary is this. Canada's 2026 wildfire season opened slowly, sitting below its own 5-year average as recently as early July, before exploding into a national emergency within about 10 days, driven largely by the same heat dome that baked the eastern United States over the 4th of July holiday and dried out Ontario's own vegetation in the process. Close to 800 active fires are burning nationally as of today, concentrated most heavily in northwestern Ontario, Nova Scotia, and the Northwest Territories. Even as much of Western Canada sits under comparatively low fire danger thanks to recent rainfall. Smoke from these fires has pushed more than 100 million Americans under air quality alerts, obscured the Manhattan skyline, and closed beaches in Chicago, reaching as far as the Arctic and the open Atlantic, according to European satellite monitoring. This season remains below the historic extremes of 2023, Canada's worst wildfire year on record. But the sheer speed of this year's escalation is exactly what has fire scientists watching the rest of the summer closely rather than assuming the worst has already passed. We are going to keep tracking this as the season develops through August. Sourced the same way we did today, straight from the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Centre, the Government of Canada's own official updates, and the scientists actually tracking the smoke by satellite, not recycled headlines. Subscribe so you do not miss the next update, because based on the forecast for continued above-average heat and dry conditions, this season is very likely not finished escalating. And leave that comment below. Tell me where you are watching from, and whether the smoke from these fires has reached you personally this summer, because for tens of millions of people living nowhere near an actual forest, it already has. Because behind every one of these numbers is a firefighter in northwestern Ontario who has had to abandon a direct attack on a fire that outpaced the resources sent to stop it. A family in Neskantaga First Nation living under a state of emergency because of a fire close enough to threaten their own community. Someone in Chicago who had no idea a wildfire burning 1,000 miles away was the reason their city closed its beaches this month. And a resident of Halifax who spent this July watching a fire named after a road they have probably driven down 100 times. 5,000 likes on this one. Let us go. See you in the next one.